Hello. General Hospital today will reveal Ava and Sidwell, once an inconceivable pairing in the turbulent world of Port Charles, are now becoming one of the most controversial and dangerous alliances the town has witnessed in years. What began as seemingly coincidental encounters has quietly evolved into a relationship laced with both emotional entanglement and moral decay. Their bond, growing stronger each day, carries with it consequences far greater than either of them initially understood. Sidwell, a man whose charisma masks his ruthlessness, has captivated Ava with more than just charm. Beneath his cold exterior lies a calculating mind, capable of manipulating the legal system, orchestrating acts of violence, and eliminating obstacles without remorse. For Ava, whose maternal instincts and personal trauma have long driven her, Sidwell's promises offered both a chance at redemption and revenge. But in placing her trust in such a man, she has unknowingly surrendered herself and her daughter to a perilous game of power. From the beginning, Ava's motivations were singular, reclaiming custody of Avery from Sonny, a man who had dominated her world for years by wielding their shared child as both shield and sword. Stripped of legal leverage and haunted by past mistakes, Ava's desperation made her vulnerable. Sidwell arrived at just the right moment, presenting himself as a strategic partner rather than a threat. With his vast network and legal influence, he assured Ava that he could shift the scales of custody in her favor. Seduced by the promise of motherhood restored, Ava ignored the red flags. She provided Sidwell with inside information secrets about Valentine Casadine's movements, the hidden vulnerabilities of Spoon Island, and even private correspondence between the elite of Port Charles. Each disclosure deepened their alliance and darkened her path. Sidwell's assurances felt intoxicating, but with every deal struck, Ava sank further into a web spun not just by ambition, but by something more sinister. It wasn't long before Sidwell's darker nature began to emerge in ways Ava could no longer deny. Whispers of his involvement in the disappearance of enemies, his shadowy ties to underground operatives, and his icy indifference to collateral damage became harder to dismiss. Yet Ava, having already stepped too far across a moral line, chose silence over confrontation. She had made her deal with the devil, and now she had to live with it. What troubled her most, however, was the knowledge that Avery, the very reason she entered this alliance, was increasingly exposed to the orbit of a man capable of unspeakable things. Sidwell began suggesting extended visits to Windermere, pitching it as a safe and serene haven for Avery. But Ava knew that Windermere, with its cavernous halls and secrets buried deep beneath its foundations, was anything but safe. Still, to deny Sidwell's request now would be to risk everything: her custody battle, her newfound stability, and possibly her life. For Sonny, the moment he learned of Ava's growing closeness with Sidwell was a declaration of war. Protective to the core, Sonny had tolerated many of Ava's missteps in the name of co-parenting. But this was beyond the pale. He knew Sidwell not only as a manipulator, but as a killer, a man with no conscience, and an insatiable thirst for dominance. The thought of Avery being influenced or even touched by someone like Sidwell was enough to send Sonny into a cold fury. But what made matters worse was the legal bind Sidwell had managed to create. Sonny found himself gradually cornered, losing ground in court and public opinion. With every move seemingly anticipated and countered by Sidwell's silent machinations, eventually, facing immense legal pressure, Sonny made the gut-wrenching decision to agree to join custody with Ava, effectively allowing Avery to spend unsupervised time in Sidwell's proximity. It was a bitter pill to swallow, one that left Sonny both humiliated and terrified. Ava, meanwhile, began to sense that the victory she had so longed for was, in truth, a dangerous illusion. Sidwell's control over her life extended far beyond legal strategy. He began dictating her movements, questioning her loyalties, and isolating her from old allies. Any attempt to assert independence was met with subtle threats, veiled references to Avery's safety, or to compromising information Ava had once casually shared. It became clear to her that Sidwell didn't love her in any healthy sense. He possessed her. Their relationship, once rooted in shared ambition, had mutated into something far more unbalanced and volatile. But even as she recognized the danger, Ava found herself trapped. If she tried to extricate herself, she risked losing Avery again, or worse, putting her daughter in the direct line of fire. If she stayed, she would be complicit in exposing Avery to a man whose morality was defined by self-interest and silence. At the same time, others in Port Charles were taking notice. Carly, ever vigilant when it came to protecting the extended family, grew increasingly alarmed. Her instincts told her that Sidwell's involvement in Ava's life wasn't just a personal entanglement. It was a calculated infiltration of the Corinthos inner circle. Carly had never trusted Ava, but she had at least believed the woman capable of recognizing danger when she saw it. Now, watching from the sidelines as Ava allowed Sidwell to inch closer to Avery, Carly's patience ran out. She confronted Ava, threatened legal action, and began gathering evidence of Sidwell's criminal activities. She knew the court of public opinion could be swayed, especially with Sonny's resources, and she vowed to use every tool available to keep Avery safe. But even Carly couldn't predict how deep Sidwell's influence ran, or how many allies he had already compromised. As the storm gathered strength, Ava stood alone at the center, emotionally torn and psychologically strained. She loved her daughter, of that there was no doubt, but her pursuit of justice and motherhood had morphed into something else entirely, a slow descent into moral compromise and quiet terror. Sidwell, ever watchful, continued to manipulate her with whispered assurances and cold-eyed commands. He positioned himself not only as her lover and legal savior, but as the only person who could truly protect her from Sonny's wrath. Yet it was increasingly clear to Ava that the true threat to her safety and Avery's future was standing right beside her. Still, every time she thought of escaping, of reaching out to Laura or even Sonny for help, she hesitated. The trap had been laid too carefully, the stakes raised to high. Now, as the legal and emotional battles intensify, poor Charles watches with bated breath. What will Ava do? Will she find the courage to turn against Sidwell and face the consequences of her alliance with him? Will Sonny, fueled by paternal instinct and rage, finally strike back in a way that exposes Sidwell's empire of control? Or will Avery, the innocent child caught between ambition and obsession, become the ultimate casualty in a war she never chose to be part of? These are the questions that hang heavy in the air, as the shadows deepen and the line between protection and possession grows ever thinner. For years, Sonny had learned to keep his guard up around anyone who hovered too close to Ava Jerome. His instincts, honed by a lifetime of betrayal and bloodshed, rarely failed him. But something about Ava's recent demeanor triggered a deeper alarm. She was no longer the disoriented, desperate woman clinging to fragments of motherhood and redemption. No, Sonny now saw in her the sharpened edge of someone emboldened by influence, of a woman who had found dangerous confidence in the company of someone far more sinister than he had anticipated. And that someone was Jen Sidwell. The transformation in Ava did not go unnoticed. Her steps were more certain, her gaze colder, her demands regarding Avery more aggressive, and above all, she no longer seemed intimidated by Sonny. That was the true warning sign. Sonny didn't need to see the full picture to understand the implications. Someone was empowering Ava from behind the scenes. When he confirmed that Sidwell had become a frequent presence in Ava's life, Sonny's suspicion evolved into fury. He knew Sidwell's history. A master manipulator with blood on his hands and no allegiance to anyone but himself. Sidwell was not the kind of man to associate with lightly, and the fact that he had now aligned himself with the mother of Sonny's daughters set off alarm bells. Sonny could not ignore. What infuriated Sonny more than anything was not merely the alliance itself, but the message it sent. Ava was no longer simply acting out of motherly desperation. She was engaging in a calculated campaign to strip him of his rights, to undo the hard-fought stability he had created for Avery. It was a betrayal Sonny hadn't anticipated, especially from a woman he once believed, despite her flaws, would never endanger their child. But Sidwell changed everything. With his grip on legal loopholes, media influence, and the darker forces of Port Charles, Sidwell orchestrated a legal siege that began to corner Sonny from all sides. Articles questioning Sonny's past began surfacing. Judges who once sympathized with him were suddenly unavailable. Investigations quietly opened against his businesses. Everything had the invisible fingerprints of Sidwell's influence. It wasn't just a custody battle anymore, it was psychological warfare. Under relentless pressure, Sonny found himself cornered in a way he hadn't been in years. He was forced into a legal compromise that left him with little recourse. A joint custody arrangement that granted Ava more access to Avery than he was comfortable with. On paper, it was a fair agreement, but in reality, it was a quiet surrender. Ava, backed by Sidwell's unrelenting legal machinery, had emerged victorious. Sonny was left holding his rage in silence, knowing full well that this arrangement gave Sidwell indirect access to his daughter. The sense of helplessness that followed wasn't just about custody, it was about the looming fear of losing Avery to a man with no soul. And Avery, in her innocence, became the silent casualty. Too young to grasp the complexities of legal documents or the moral decay of adults, she found herself once again caught between two opposing forces. Her visits with Ava became longer, and gradually, Ava began introducing subtle changes, new toys, new routines, a new environment at Windermere. Sidwell, never far, began making appearances under the pretense of family bonding. Ava, blinded by what she believed was a chance at building a normal family unit, failed to see the emotional manipulation Sidwell was inflicting upon them both. To Ava, the victory of reclaiming Avery was intoxicating proof that she could rewrite the narrative that had always cast her as the unfit mother. But that triumph came at a price she hadn't fully considered. The Sidwell who once whispered reassurance in her ear now began making demands. Windermere, with its haunting legacy and cavernous silence, became the symbol of a fresh start. Sidwell's idea of a sanctuary for their new family. Ava hesitated. She felt the eeriness of the proposal, the symbolism of raising her daughter in a house built on secrets and blood, but the promise of escape from the shadow of Sonny, the illusion of safety, and the whispered dreams of a family that never abandoned her, were temptations she found impossible to reject. For Sonny, the suggestion that his daughter might one day call Windermere home was a final insult. That house, steeped in Casadini darkness and now crawling with Sidwell's influence, was no place for a child, especially not his child. The idea of Avery spending nights under the same roof as a man who once made thinly veiled threats toward Ace Casadini was beyond comprehension. Sonny knew what Sidwell was capable of, and while the cord had tied his hands, his instincts screamed for action. He began quietly rallying allies: Laura Collins, Carly, even Dante, preparing for what he feared would be a more covert battle. This was no longer about legalities. It was about survival. In the quiet corners of his mind, Sonny also wrestled with heartbreak. For all his history with Ava, the betrayals, the manipulations, the anger, he had always clung to one belief: that she would never endanger Avery, no matter how much they hated each other. But now that trust had fractured. Ava had chosen ambition cloaked as love. She had chosen Sidwell, and in doing so, she had opened the door for something far more dangerous to take root. Meanwhile, Ava, though outwardly composed, began to feel the cracks forming beneath the surface. Sidwell's once charming control now felt suffocating. He questioned her every move, limited her interactions with others, and began isolating her emotionally. What she once interpreted as protection now revealed itself as possession. And in the quiet hours, when Avery was asleep and the halls of Windermere echoed with ghosts of the past, Ava wondered if she had walked too far down a path she could no longer escape. Both Sonny and Ava stood at the edge of an emotional cliff, each clinging to different versions of love, power, and parenthood. And at the center of it all, Avery, too young to understand, too innocent to choose, remained the one soul who would bear the weight of every choice, every betrayal, and every silent war fought in her name. The future was uncertain, but one thing had become terrifyingly clear: the deeper Ava sank into Sidwell's world, the harder it would be to pull her daughter back from it. Carly had always been skeptical of Ava's intentions, but in recent weeks, that skepticism had begun to transform into something deeper, something closer to dread, as she observed Ava's increasing involvement with Jen Sidwell, a man whose name alone conjured images of manipulation, coercion, and shadowy control. Carly could no longer suppress the gnawing sense that something terrible was on the horizon. Her mistrust of Ava was nothing new, but it was no longer just about old grudges or power plays. Now, it was about Avery. And when it came to protecting that little girl, Carly had never drawn lines between biological ties and emotional bonds. In her heart, Avery was family, and the thought of Sidwell inserting himself into the child's life sent cold shivers down Carly's spine. There was something disturbingly strategic about the way Sidwell had maneuvered into Ava's orbit. He didn't barge into her life, he seeped into it, slowly and deliberately, like smoke through a crack in the door. And Ava, perhaps too hungry for power or too desperate to maintain her fragile grip on motherhood, had let him in. Carly watched from the sidelines as Ava transformed from a woman clinging to redemption to someone dangerously entangled in Sidwell's web. What began as a tactical alliance had twisted into something deeper, darker. Ava and Sidwell were no longer merely working together, they had become emotionally enmeshed, feeding off each other's needs, traumas, and secrets. It was a bond that seemed less like love and more like psychological captivity. To Carly, the danger was obvious. Sidwell wasn't just a threat to Sonny's legacy, he was a threat to Avery's safety. The man's history was littered with stories of coercion, threats, even disappearances. And now, he was stepping into a paternal role in a child's life? It was unthinkable. Carly began to realize that her silence was no longer an option. If she didn't act, no one would. A confrontation with Ava became inevitable. Carly had no intention of playing the passive observer. While Sidwell wormed his way deeper into Sonny's family and rewrote the definition of protection and parenthood, every instinct in her body told her to go to war, and she was ready for it. But even Carly could see that the situation was more complex than it seemed on the surface. Ava wasn't simply being manipulated, she was also complicit. She had allowed Sidwell into her world. She had offered him access. And somewhere along the line, she had convinced herself that his influence was worth the risk. But was it love? Or was Ava merely drowning in the illusion of control, too afraid to admit how much she had surrendered to him already? Carly suspected the latter. It wasn't like Ava to submit to anyone, not Sonny, not Nicola's, not even her own family. But with Sidwell, there was something different. He didn't overpower her, he embedded himself in her decisions. Whispered reassurances, while slowly replacing her judgment with his own. It was a psychological seduction, not just emotional or physical. And Ava had become a willing prisoner in her own narrative. And Sidwell, true to form, began to show signs of possessiveness that bordered on obsession. His influence over Ava extended beyond legal strategy or romantic gestures. He inserted himself into her daily life, offering opinions about who she should see, where she should go, and most chillingly, how she should raise Avery. His reach extended even further, as Carly learned that he had deployed operatives to quietly surveil Sonny's movements, Carly's activities, and even Avery's school schedule. It wasn't just protective paranoia, it was control. Ava's world was no longer her own, and yet, the deeper she sank into Sidwell's influence, the harder it became to recognize the manipulation for what it was. Ava had once dreamed of a life where she could be the central figure in her daughter's life again. She had envisioned freedom, stability, and the power to raise Avery without Sonny's looming presence. But what she got instead was a gilded cage alive, where Sidwell held the keys. And every act of defiance came with a price. On more than one occasion, Ava had contemplated leaving, cutting ties with Sidwell before it was too late. But every time she approached the idea, he reminded her subtly, chillingly, of the secrets she had entrusted him with, of the legal traps he had laid in her name, and worst of all, of Avery's vulnerability. Sidwell never threatened the child outright. He didn't have to. His insinuations were enough, and Ava, feeling the weight of her own choices, found herself paralyzed by fear. To Carly, these were red flags no one else seemed willing to acknowledge. She knew what it looked like when a strong woman became ensnared in a toxic relationship. She had seen it before in her friends, in herself, and she recognized the signs. Ava's confidence, once fierce and defiant, was now brittle and calculated. She spoke less often in public. She avoided direct answers about Sidwell. Her eyes, once full of venom, now carried flickers of unease. Carly didn't just want to confront her, she wanted to save her. Not because she cared for Ava, but because Avery deserved better than this nightmare masquerading as a family. And yet, Carly knew that exposing Sidwell would not be easy. The man was meticulous, always staying several steps ahead. Any misstep could push him into retaliating against Sonny, against Carly, or worse, against Avery. So Carly played a longer game. She started compiling evidence, gathering testimonials, working her way through back channels to build a case strong enough to rip Sidwell out of Ava's life permanently. But time was not on her side. Every day that passed with Sidwell still in control was another day. Avery's world grew more uncertain. The line between protection and vengeance began to blur. Carly wasn't sure anymore whether she was acting for Avery's sake, or because she couldn't bear to see Sidwell win. But in her heart, she knew one thing: she would not allow this man to bury his roots any deeper into Sonny's family tree. Not while she was still standing. And if Ava couldn't break free, then Carly would break the chains for her whether she liked it or not. In the silence that often followed long nights in Port Charles, a war was brewing. One waged not with guns or threats, but with secrets, surveillance, and legal maneuvering. Sidwell had underestimated how far Carly would go for someone she considered her own. And Ava, caught between the man who promised her power and the woman who saw through the lies, stood on a precipice. The next move could change everything for her, for Sidwell, and most tragically, for Avery, whose safety still hung by the thinnest of threads. Sonny Corinthos had been pushed to the edge before, but this was different. This time, the threat wasn't from a rival mob boss or a federal agent. It was far more insidious. Jen Sidwell was not only poisoning the legal system but now entangling himself in Sonny's family, manipulating Ava, and inching dangerously close to permanent custody over Avery. For Sonny, that wasn't just a legal battle, it was a matter of protecting the soul of his daughter. In a desperate move to counter Sidwell's growing grip, Sonny turned to someone he rarely relied on for help in family matters: Laura Collins. As the mayor of Port Charles and someone who had battled her own share of villains, Laura was not only a respected ally, but a woman of action. She understood what it meant to fight from inside the system while knowing how to navigate around it, when needed. Together, Sonny and Laura began assembling a case, a meticulous and covert effort to expose Sidwell for who he really was. They combed through archived intelligence, spoke to international contacts, and reached out to whistleblowers who had once worked under Sidwell's thumb. What they uncovered painted a picture drenched in blood and corruption. A man tied to extortion plots across several states, a string of disappearances of those who challenged him, and sealed records that strongly suggested Sidwell had used his resources to bury criminal activity through bribery and coercion. But evidence, no matter how damning, required timing, and time was exactly what Sonny no longer had. Sidwell's plan was accelerating. Through relentless legal maneuvering and backdoor influence over key judges and child advocacy groups, he was fast-tracking a petition to transfer full custody of Avery to Ava, effectively pushing Sonny out of the picture completely. Ava, still caught in the seductive pull of Sidwell's promises and veiled threats, had become a pawn in his endgame, unaware of just how close she was to losing everything, not just Sonny's trust, but her own autonomy. If the petition succeeded, Sonny wouldn't just lose custody, he would lose the last thread of control in a family unraveling. Before his eyes, his name would be tarnished in court, his fatherhood questioned, and the legacy he had tried to build for Avery would be reduced to whispers in Sidwell's shadow. And while the adults clashed in legal chambers and private war rooms, the child at the center of it all, Avery, began to bear the emotional weight of a world spinning out of control. Once surrounded by warmth, predictability, and love, Avery now found herself drifting between cold, quiet nights at Windermere and the tense silences of her mother's increasingly controlled behavior. She didn't have the words to describe it, but something in the air had changed. The towering walls of Windermere no longer seemed like a castle. They felt like a prison wrapped in velvet. The staff, once friendly, now avoided eye contact. Sidwell's smiles felt hollow, and Ava, who used to read her bedtime stories and stroke her hair, seemed distracted, constantly on edge, whispering on the phone when she thought Avery wasn't listening. Avery began waking up in the middle of the night, trembling. She started having nightmares, images of her father yelling, her mother crying, Sidwell watching from a shadowy corner with cold eyes. In one dream, she wandered the halls of Windermere alone, unable to find a way out. These weren't just childhood fears, they were psychological tremors of a child, absorbing the toxic emotions swirling around her. And while no one wanted to admit it, Avery was beginning to show signs of trauma. Her drawings became darker, her laughter less frequent, and she started asking when she could go back to the house that feels happy. It was a heartbreaking question with no simple answer. Meanwhile, the question no longer was whether Sidwell posed a threat. That was a given. The only question left was when he would show his true hand and who would pay the price. Would it be Sonny, stripped of his daughter and his dignity? Would it be Ava, consumed by guilt and caught deep in Sidwell's web to escape? Or would it be Avery herself, forced to navigate a childhood shaped by manipulation, fear, and broken trust? Ava had once believed that reclaiming custody of Avery would liberate her, but instead she now found herself shackled by invisible chains, each one forged from her compromises and Sidwell's lies. Every time she considered walking away, Sidwell reminded her of the secrets she had confessed, the things she had done to win. He held them like weapons, always ready to fire. And worse still, he used Avery as a silent hostage, warning Ava that any rebellion would result in unfortunate consequences. Words that chilled her to the bone. Sonny, on the other hand, was teetering between strategy and desperation. His alliance with Laura offered hope, but hope alone wouldn't protect Avery if Sidwell moved faster than they could react. Sonny knew this wasn't a battle he could win in court alone. If he was to save his daughter, he might have to step outside the lines of the law, something he had long tried to avoid for her sake. But the clock was ticking, and every delay brought Sidwell one step closer to total control. In this world where emotions could be twisted into weapons, and the title of parent became a pawn on a chessboard of power and pride, the war over Avery Corinthos had become more than a custody dispute. It had become a reckoning. The stakes were no longer just about rights, they were about Avery's very sense of self, her peace, her innocence. And as a final confrontation loomed, no one, not Sonny, not Ava, not even Carly, could say for certain who would survive it with their soul intact. Because in this fight, love had become indistinguishable from possession, and protection had morphed into obsession. The only question left was whether anyone would act in time to pull Avery out of the shadows, before she was lost in them forever.